Have you ever had the fear of being buried alive? Well, for one Irish woman named Margie McCall, that fear became a reality. Her legend begins in 1705. Margorie Mccall was just a normal, healthy woman until one day she became deadly ill. It's not known what illness caused her to fall into a death-like state, but she was ultimately pronounced dead, and the family mourned their loss. During the wake, her husband tried removing her ring, most likely her beloved wedding ring, but just couldn't due to her fingers being too swollen. So he left the ring on and buried her with care in the Shankill graveyard. Shortly after, Margie was laid to rest, and when the coast was clear, grave robbers got to work digging up her coffin. They pried open the lid and spotted her ring, but unable to wiggle it off, the man took out his knife and made the first cut into her finger, drawing blood. This triggered a response from the supposed corpse. Her eyes opened, she sat straight up, and she screamed. One story says that the robbers died of fright on the spot, and others say that they fled into the night and gave up their unsavory activities forever. Marjorie was then able to climb up out of her grave and find her way back home. Her husband John, who happened to be a doctor, yes, a doctor, and I have so many questions. Well, he was at home with the children at the time when a soft knock at the door was heard. He reminisced and told them, "If your mother were still alive, I'd swear that was her knock." So he went to the door and he opened it. Standing there in the doorway was his wife, dressed in her burial clothes, now covered in dirt, blood dripping from her injured finger, but very much alive. The shock was just too much for him, and he dropped dead at her feet. So he was then buried in the now empty plot his wife had just occupied. Marjorie is said to have remarried and gone on to have several more children. Years later, when she finally died and stayed dead, she was reburied in Shankill Cemetery in Lurgan, Ireland, where her gravestone still stands today and reads, "Margorie McCall lived once, buried twice." So there's no official documents to support the story, but that's most likely due to the records being lost during what is called the Irish Famine in Ireland. And it was also called the Blian an Ar, hope I pronounced that right, which translates to Year of Slaughter. Now, this was a period of a mass starvation and disease in Ireland from 1740 to 1741, and caused by a series of extremely harsh winters. Now, jumping back to the subject, taphophobia is the fear of being buried alive, and it is quite common. In fact, people back then were so afraid of the prospect that they would install a bell above ground, linked to the inside of coffins, giving prematurely buried people a chance to get help. It was called a safety or security coffin, mostly used during the 18th and 19th centuries. And this brought about the term graveyard shift, and this was when a designated night watchman would sit all night in a graveyard listening for any bells to ring. Kind of creepy, but I guess it seems like a pretty chill job. So let's analyze the story just a little bit. She would have had to have been sick enough for her body to put itself into a coma, and fearing she had a contagious illness, they would have decided to bury her quickly, unfortunately not giving her enough time to regain consciousness on her own. So given the fact that her husband was a doctor, he must have been the one to pronounce her dead, right? I mean, did anyone else check to see if she was actually legitimately dead? So inside the coffin itself, which hers would have been made of wood, given her size and very shallow breathing, she would have had perhaps a few hours until she ran out of oxygen. If she had woken up while still buried, she would have obviously panicked and hyperventilated, understandably. Carbon dioxide would replace the oxygen much faster though, giving her possibly minutes until she suffocated, fell unconscious, with her organs shutting down one by one, and then finally her heart stopping. Obviously, the robbers would have dug her up very soon after her burial, inadvertently saving her life. While Marjorie's story has become an urban legend, here are 4 true stories to show that hers is more than possible. After all legends have some truth to them, right? Number 1. In 1822, a 40-year-old German shoemaker was declared dead by his family. Oddly, his body never went rigid though, but he of course looked dead. He was buried only to be saved at the last moment when the gravedigger heard the man knocking from inside the coffin. Quickly digging up the grave and opening the lid, he saw that the shoemaker's arms were drawn upward. He still wasn't cold, and he bled freely when the doctor opened a vein. They tried to revive him over the next couple days, but sadly, he passed away and was again buried, this time for good. Number 2, in 1937, 19-year-old Frenchman Angelo Hayes was buried after a bad motorcycle accident that fractured his skull. 2 days later, he was exhumed for insurance purposes, and they discovered that he was still warm and had a pulse. Angelo had fallen into a coma, which preserved his oxygen supply, saving his life. He then went on to become a celebrity and later invented a coffin that could sustain human life. Number 3. In early 1891, newlyweds Octavia Smith and James Hatcher welcomed a son named Jacob. Sadly, infant mortality rates were high in the 1800s, and Jacob died in infancy. The loss of her little boy put Octavia into a deep depression that left her bedridden for months. Later, she developed an odd illness. She fell into a coma, and nothing could wake her. She was pronounced dead in May of 1891. She was buried quickly, but things got weird when other townsfolk fell into the same coma-like sleep, only to wake up several days later. They assumed she had the sleeping sickness, which was caused by the bite of the tsetse fly. Tsetse? Nasty bugs. But it's very unlikely that this bug native to Africa found its way to Kentucky. More likely it was toxic fumes from a nearby coal mine or some other type of mysterious and severe illness. Knowing this, James panicked and he thought of his wife. If others were waking up, Octavia must have too. He was correct. She did wake up, but her airtight coffin and extreme fear at waking up in a small, dark, silent box sent her into a panic attack. They quickly dug up her coffin and pried open the lid, only to find the lining of the coffin was shredded from Octavia's fingernails, her face frozen in a mask of terror. Poor James had to rebury his wife, but he erected a lifelike monument in her image that sits above her grave. Number 4. In 1930, Essie Dunbar suffered from a severe epilepsy attack. She was pronounced dead and placed in a coffin, due to be buried the next day. This gave her sister from out of town time to make it there to attend the funeral. Unfortunately, her sister arrived too late, and she was not content to simply mourn a freshly dug grave piled high with dirt. She ordered her sister to be dug up so she could say goodbye properly. So when they opened the lid, Essie sat straight up and simply smiled at them. No doubt giving everyone the shock of their lives, but in a good way. Essie went on to live another 47 years, and she is one lucky woman. So it seems that there's kind of a few of these stories of being buried alive, not only from way back then, but you hear that sometimes even in modern news. And those are just the ones that we know were actually buried alive. How many others were and we didn't know it? So put me down for the safety coffin and the little bell. So there you have it, 5 macabre stories to ponder about. But what do you think about the bell ringing idea? Or would you be willing to work as a night watchman, sitting alone in a cemetery in the dark, waiting for those ghostly bells to ring? Let me know in the comment section below what you think. And also, thank you guys so much for watching Lady in the Library, where we explore history one page at a time. Until next time, guys, take care. Bye!